Good afternoon, Benjamin Hadfield. Teach Me to Dive. We've got a special guest for us today. Simon Mitchell is renowned for his occupational medicine, hyperbaric medicine, and anesthesiology expertise. His extensive contributions to the medical research with over 45 published papers reflect his commitment to advancing understandings in these fields. Now, beyond his medical pursuits, Simon is a very accomplished CCR technical diver, deeply engaged in exploring the depths, particularly in investigating shipwrecks at extreme depths. Now, with his PhD in medicine and various diplomas in diving and hyperbaric medicine, he currently serves as an associate professor of anesthesiology and head of the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of Auckland. Now, recognized for his outstanding contributions, Dr. Mitchell has received multiple awards, including the Albert Benke Award from the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medical Society, as well as the Dan Rolex Diver of the Year. He has all manner of accolades and expertise for us. Simon, thanks for coming in today.
It's a pleasure, Benjamin. No, I'm always keen to talk to divers. You know, that's my constituent group. I'm one of you, right? So putting something back into the sport that I've got so much out of is always a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate you coming in and taking, I think we've all read a number of your papers and enjoyed them thoroughly. And I'll be honest, when you get into your deeper works, I certainly get in the weeds and I reread them a few times to ensure that I understand what you're saying in a clear, concise way, because you really can get in the weeds very quickly. That's for sure. But so tell us, Simon, how did you get involved in hyperbaric research?
Kind of all stems from my diving history, and I'm sure I share this sort of thing with many people who've made diving part of their career. But I grew up in a seaside suburb in New Zealand, diving. It's what the kids did, and I just fell in love with it. And from that point on, kind of all the decisions I made about my career stemmed or flowed from that. So, you know, when I left school, I initially did marine biology, then I did medicine, then I went to the Navy to do diving medicine. After the Navy, it was hyperbaric medicine and then anesthesiology. And all of this had, you know, diving linkages. And throughout that entire time, I stayed in touch with my passion for diving, you know, reinvented myself as a diver lots of times, you know, so it was spearfishing and then underwater hockey and scuba diving and then photography, then military stuff, and so on, technical diving, rebreathers, and now mainly wrecks and caves with photography. You know, photography is great because it's, you can never say you got the perfect photograph, so there's always new challenges there. But the academic side of my career focused on, you know, along with all of that I just mentioned, it focused on diving medicine research, and that's kind of how I got there with that.
That's amazing. So let's just jump in the middle of it. You're well known for your DCS research and understanding. Let's talk a little bit about DCS. Simply put, what is DCS?
Decompression sickness. Well, I think most divers understand that, when you dive breathing compressed gas, you absorb some of the inert gas that you're breathing. The deeper you go, the longer you stay there, the more inert gas you absorb. And then when you ascend, that gas wants to come out of solution. You know, if you've dissolved it in your body fluids, it wants to come back out as the pressure around you decreases. So it can do that either by being breathed out, which is what we want, or it can form bubbles. And that's more likely to occur if we come up quickly and don't give it time, if you will, to diffuse out normally or diffuse out in the way we want it to. So those bubbles can form in tissues or in the bloodstream, and it's those bubbles which ultimately cause the problems that we refer to as decompression sickness.
So it sounds like you're really pushing forward the idea that bubble theory is still a thing, it's still here, and it's still quite real.
Well, when you say bubble theory, I don't think there's ever been any real doubt that decompression sickness, that like the primary vector of injury in decompression sickness is bubbles. Sometimes people talk about bubble theory in relation to decompression strategy, so we'd be referring to bubble models. That's an entirely different subject. But in terms of decompression sickness, bubbles are the primary vector of injury that kicks off the process. And then it becomes like many things in medicine, it becomes a complicated disease entity with inflammation and various other processes, kicking in and contributing to the symptom pattern that we see. But fundamentally, it's a disease kicked off by bubble formation.
Okay. Can you explain a little bit how these bubbles form and some of the ways that they can grow?
Well, the key thing about bubble formation is the key driver for bubble formation, I guess is the right way to put it, is where you have a situation where the dissolved pressure of nitrogen in a tissue or in the blood exceeds the ambient pressure. In other words, you've absorbed nitrogen at depth and you start to ascend, the ambient pressure surrounding you decreases, and the gas that you've absorbed hasn't had time to get out. So the pressure of dissolved gas inside you exceeds the pressure that surrounds you. And that we refer to as supersaturation. And supersaturation is the fundamental requirement for bubbles to form. Quite how they form is still a bit of a mystery, actually, because in fact, to form bubbles in pure solutions, you need massive degrees of supersaturation, way greater than what we achieve in diving. And yet we know bubbles form in the body during diving. And we think it's because there are things in the body that help bubbles form. So little things we refer to as micronuclei, which may be tiny little pockets of gas that exist in us all the time, that supersaturated gas can diffuse into and make bigger. And those become the bubbles that we can detect in decompression sickness. So, we're not entirely sure the exact physical process by which bubbles form, but we know that they form. I mean, that's very clear from studies where we use ultrasound devices to measure bubbles in the venous blood coming back towards the heart in the body. We can detect these bubbles. So we know they exist. We're just not 100% sure exactly how they form.
Fair enough. So how do you actually study hyperbaric research in divers? What do you actually get 50 divers, get them together and say, we're going to keep diving until you bend? Or what does the process actually look like?
Well, if you're studying decompression science, or say, for example, decompression strategies, like we want to figure out what's the best way to decompress. Do we do stops here, or do we do stops here, or like that kind of research, I guess, is what you're referring to.
Sure.
It's a really interesting and good question, because of course, diving people, until they get decompression sickness, as a way of figuring out the best strategies, is potentially fraught from an ethical perspective. Although there are some groups in diving medicine research, and particularly the US Navy, that do exactly that. However, when they do it, they have appropriately strict protocols in place to ensure that anyone who does get decompression sickness symptoms is immediately recompressed. So when they do these experiments, they have a hyperbaric chamber right there. The divers sit outside the hyperbaric chamber for several hours after the experimental dives, and they get any symptoms at all, they're straight in the chamber. And in fact, they have a long history of doing that. And everyone who's recompressed immediately after these experimental dives, if they get symptoms, then they do well. They don't have any problems with it. In many places, though, we wouldn't be allowed to even do that. So the surrogate endpoint for a lot of decompression research is what I alluded to before, which is using ultrasound to look at the heart and see bubbles coming back from the body in the venous blood. And the number of those bubbles is an index of decompression stress. So the more bubbles you see, the more decompression stress is associated with whatever it is you did to provoke that. So the primary, in answer to your question, yeah, you do. You bring a whole bunch of divers together, you dive them in different ways that you're trying to study, and then you look at these bubbles to see which way of decompressing, or whatever strategy it is you're testing, which one produces the least number of bubbles. And that's the most common way of doing this kind of work. But as I say, some groups still use decompression sickness as an outcome measure, and those studies, of course, are amazing. I mean, that's a kind of a more valid means of studying decompression sickness, to actually use decompression sickness symptoms as the endpoint in your experiments.
But how would you determine them to be overly accurate in the idea that DCS affects us in different ways on different days? For example, today I may be more prone, tomorrow maybe I'm not, based upon a whole variety and cavalcade of values.
Yeah, no, well, that's a really good question too. And in fact, the journal that I'm the editor of, Diving and Hyperbaric Medicine, just literally last month published what I would consider a landmark study by that group I was alluding to in the US Navy, the Naval Experimental Diving Unit group, who have performed, hundreds, if not more than 1,000 experimental dives, that they have very accurate bubble count data, the sort of data I was describing before. And many of these dives involve the same diver doing exactly the same dive multiple times. And to your point, what they've shown is that the same diver, same individual, doing an identical dive, and when I say identical, I mean time, depth, decompression stops, exercise, temperature, all these things that we think might be important for determining bubble formation. What they've shown is that when they do these identical dives, they can produce very different numbers of bubbles on different days, which is exactly what you were just saying, essentially.
Sure.
And that is important because what it tells us is that obsessing about exactly how we decompress, while it's important, it's probably no more important than trying to figure out why we see this variability in the same diver between different days. And we still don't have an answer to that. We don't know the answer to that question. And this paper, I think, that was published last month, will I think, drive an initiative to look a lot more closely at that. In other words, what is it that these individual divers are doing in their daily life? Or what is it about their physiology that varies, that changes the number of bubbles they produce on an identical dive done on different days? I mean, it's an amazingly important question. And we've never really had that in sharp focus before. We've spent a lot of time arguing, debating, studying how to decompress from dives. What's the best way of distributing your stops, your decompression stops, and your times. But in fact, it may actually be more important to identify why it is that individuals bubble differently on different days. And I think you'll find that will be a very prominent part of diving medicine research going forward over the next 10 years.
You kind of touched on it a little bit. What are some of the things that need to align in order for a diver to actually experience DCS symptoms?
Well, I guess that's the question I'm asking. I mean, I'm not sure I have the entire answer to that. In fact, I don't know. But however, obviously you have to dive. You have to do a dive that's deep enough and long enough to absorb sufficient inert gas that you will produce some bubbles to put you in that zone, right? So like diving to 3 meters for 30 minutes is not going to produce bubbles, or very few. But, so putting you in the bubble production zone, you need a dive that's going to do that. Then there's a few risk factors that we understand that could provoke or make those bubbles that you form more likely to provoke symptoms. So a classic example of that is what's commonly referred to as a patent foramen ovale, or a PFO, which is a communication between the upper chambers of the heart, the right and left upper chambers. So bubbles appear in the veins because the veins is blood coming from the tissues. So the tissues is where the nitrogen is. The bubbles form there. They pass into the veins, come back towards the heart. And normally those bubbles get filtered out by the lungs. Lungs are a very good filter for bubbles in the veins coming back to the lungs. And the lungs stop those bubbles getting over onto the arterial side of the circulation, which would carry them everywhere in the body. But if you've got a communication between the two upper chambers of the heart, then those bubbles can bypass the lungs. And And we know that's a risk factor for decompression sickness or certain forms of decompression sickness. And that's been known for quite some time. So if you form bubbles and you've got one of those communications, a PFO, patent foramen ovale, then that puts you at higher risk. So that there's a recipe there for suffering decompression sickness in some form. But the point I was making before is that we still don't know what it is on any particular day that predisposes you to forming more bubbles or less bubbles. So those are the things we still need to find out. I mean, there are some ideas, things like dehydration, the temperature profile of your dive, and we actually do know that can be a problem. So getting cold during a dive seems to be a provocation. Being overweight is hypothetically a possibility, some more body fat, so absorbing more nitrogen into fat during the dive. These are all things that, we think are important, but some of them have better evidential basis than others. So the temperature one is a big one, but, being overweight, doing exercise at depth might make you take up more inert gas. I mean, these are all things that we need to research more thoroughly to fully understand the process.
Fair enough. It's also been discussed and studied a bit on the effects of exercise prior to a dive in terms of DCS as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting line of research. It started out about 20 years ago, in fact, when it was almost serendipitously discovered that rats that were exercised prior to a very provocative dive, that killed a lot of the rats, were somewhat protected, in fact, quite dramatically so. And that sparked this interest in exercise prior to diving as a means of reducing bubble formation. And there have been a few experiments in humans looking at exercise at various times in the 24-hour period prior to a dive, and pretty much they all show the same thing, that if you do significant aerobic exercise sometime in that 24-hour period before a dive, you tend to produce less bubbles after the dive. Now, that hasn't really translated into a big study that looks at actual decompression sickness as the outcome measure and whether it's a legitimate strategy that we should all be following. Lots of people would, lots of people probably wouldn't, but it may well prove to be something important. And in fact, over the years, before big dives, I have tried to do some significant aerobic exercise in the 24 hours leading up to the dive, if I can, if it's practicable. So yeah, I mean, that's a really exciting potential line of research, and it kind of feeds into the point I was making before about this recent paper that shows individual divers producing vastly different numbers of bubbles after identical dives. Could it be that in the 24 hours prior, they've been doing different levels of exercise? We don't know that, that this wasn't actually logged as part of the experimental work that I was talking about before. So, I mean, that's something that we could look at is what you do activity-wise in that 24 hours prior to going diving, perhaps one of the explanations for these vastly different numbers of bubbles that people are producing after identical dives. I mean, that's something that will almost certainly be looked at. In fact, we're thinking of looking at that.
Absolutely. It sounds like a really exciting time in bubble research and in hyperbaric medicine, that there's still a lot of things out there that we just don't really know. And so there's a lot of discoveries left to be made.
Well, that's a point. That exact point is something that I often make when I'm speaking to scientific audiences. Diving medicine is an extraordinarily exciting field in that regard. I mean, if I look at what my clinical specialty, anesthesiology, or one of my clinical specialties, it's a very highly researched, safe medical intervention where the current research it's kind of nibbling around the edges of a very well-researched specialty. However, diving medicine, there are all these, what I would refer to as low-hanging fruit questions that still haven't been answered. I mean, any other field of medicine, they would have been answered 50 years ago. But because there hasn't been a huge amount of research momentum and funding in diving medicine research. There's still all these things, and it's a really exciting field to be in for young people, young scientists coming through, because there's a whole lot of stuff that can be addressed in relatively simple studies that don't cost a fortune. They don't need 10,000 patients randomized, like some of the big clinical studies do, that answer questions of practical relevance. And we've made a bit of an art form out of doing that. I mean, we've taken some of these questions that are of particular interest to technical divers and answered them in relatively simple work that hasn't cost a fortune. And it's a terrific field to be in for that reason. Exactly right.
How exciting. How exciting to have this new and burgeoning field if we only had another 50 years of research time, maybe we'd be able to answer one of those questions, right?
Well, I mean, we are ticking them off. And like I say, this recent work by NEDU has opened up a whole new, it's basically generated a whole list of new questions, that some of which will be able to be answered relatively simply. So, I think that is very exciting. I think it's a very exciting time to be in diving medicine, no question. The big problem, of course, is funding, because finding funds, even relatively small amounts of money for these experiments can be quite difficult. Like it's the big medical research funding agencies, like the NIH in the US or the Health Research Council here in New Zealand. If you go to them saying, look, I want money to research the consequences, the complications of a discretionary recreational activity that's indulged in mainly by white middle-class males with lots of discretionary income. I mean, they just laugh at you. There's no way you get money from those kind of people. And look, I get that. Child cancer is probably more important, isn't it? But there are some groups who still fund diving medicine research. Dan is a good example. And the US Navy, we get funding. My own group gets funding from the Office of Naval Research Global, and we're deeply grateful for that, because it's what allows us to do this work that we do.
How neat. So what are some other factors that might contribute to DCS as well as reduce DCS, in your opinion?
Well, I've alluded to one or two of those in the discussion already. So obviously the time depth profile of the dive is a fundamental thing, although, as I've pointed out, people can do identical dives and have very different risk. So a few of the things that have emerged in recent years, temperature is one. So I touched on that, but I didn't explain it in any detail. So there was a study produced by NEDU, I think it's probably 10 years ago, but I don't know that it's widely known. It was published in one of their technical reports, but basically what they did was they manipulated temperature exposure during a dive so that the divers could either be, loosely put, warm during their time at the bottom and warm during decompression, or warm at bottom and cold during decompression, or the other way around. And what they showed was an amazing difference in risk of decompression sickness between being warm at the bottom and cold during decompression, or cold at the bottom and warm during decompression. And the riskiest one was being warm at the bottom and cold during decompression, by a long way. I mean, it's not subtle. It was a big difference. And that's because, almost certainly because, when you're warm, your tissues are well perfused, your skin isn't vasoconstricted, so you're absorbing gas into all those tissues. And then if you get cold during the decompression, when you're trying to get rid of that gas that you've absorbed, those tissues will vasoconstrict. That's the normal response to tissues that get cold. The blood supply shuts down so that you don't lose heat. The problem with that is that you're trying to get rid of the gas, you need blood supply. The blood is what carries the gas away. So if you get cold and shut down your blood supply, then you don't carry the gas away. So that gas doesn't escape, and so it becomes supersaturated and form bubbles. So this idea is that you're better off not getting cold during decompression, and that has informed quite a lot of what, so some of the strategies that technical divers use when diving in cold water, like not turning your suit heating on until you're actually decompressing, for example. So yeah, I mean, that's one example. There's also been some research into the time depth profiles of the dive, and we don't want to get bogged down too much in that. But as you're probably aware, in the early 2000s, there was this big trend in technical diving to use so-called bubble models for decompression, which imposed decompression stops that were a lot deeper than some of the more traditional approaches to decompression. And everybody got on board with that, including me, thought it was a great idea, but largely on the basis of theoretical attraction. It was never demonstrated in any practical way that those bubble models were better. And then about 10, 12 years ago, the US Navy, NEDU, published a study that suggested the opposite. And in fact, they weren't alone. There were several other studies that showed the same thing, that bubble models were imposing decompression stops that are actually too deep to be efficient. So during those decompression stops, some of your tissues were still absorbing inert gas. And that became a problem when you got to your shallower depths. And the bubble model decompressions actually had higher incidence of decompression sickness than the more traditional, what you might call shallow stop approaches. And so we've kind of backed away from bubble models now. We're in a sort of more intermediate zone with our initial decompression stops. They're not as deep as bubble models were prescribing. But there's another evidence-based strategy that has emerged in the last sort of 10 or 15 years that has allowed us to adjust our practice to reduce risk in an evidence-based way.
Absolutely. So I assume you're referring out to gradient factors and adding a gradient factor to your overall dynamic of adjusting.
Yeah, well, gradient factors is one way of adjusting the emphasis you put on deep stops. So back in the deep stops craze, even if you didn't use bubble models, a lot of people were adjusting their gradient factors to impose very deep stops to make a gradient factor decompression look like a bubble model. And you in gradient factors, you choose two numbers. So the gradient factor low and the gradient factor high. So it might be, in the bubble model days, that might have been something like 1090. So 10 is the number that controls the if you will, the depth of your deepest stop.
Sure.
And the lower that number, the deeper your deep stops are going to be. And then people backed away from that to some extent. So now people are using more like 50 or 60, 80 or 90. 90 determines the length of your shallow stops, but the lower number, the gradient factor low, is what determines your deepest stop. So people have backed away from the very deep stops into the, into first stops that are in more sort of intermediate depths. It's quite a complex subject. And I mean, I give whole lectures on this, and it's a bit difficult to describe in a thing like this. But essentially what has happened is we've used gradient factors to back away from deep stops as prescribed by bubble models. So, I mean, that's a good example of what I think is an evidence-based trend in diving practice to try and improve safety.
So where do you fall in the idea of the most efficient use of the gradient factor, in the 40, 50, 60 for your GF low, to raising that point up, or where are you seeing the most efficiency?
Well, look, I'm always reluctant to sort of prescribe or recommend, but I'm very happy to tell you what I do. So I choose a gradient factor low of 60, and that's an intuitive guess about where it should be, based on a fair bit of observation of various modeling strategies about supersaturation in tissues, kind of in the depth range that I'm diving in. So commonly between, my deep dives are sort of 50 to 150 meters. And in that range, that seems to be a reasonably sensible number. That's a big change from the bubble model days when we were choosing a gradient factor low of maybe 10 or 20. And my gradient factor high is usually somewhere around 70 or 80. And the 70 would mean I'm doing quite long, shallow stops. And look, that's just a strategy for trying to ensure that I'm not the one that gets decompression sickness when we're in some remote place, because I'm usually the diving physician and there'll be no one else there to look after me if I get sick. So I'm happy to do the time in the water, and that's the basis for choosing a fairly conservative gradient factor high, which drives me to do longer shallow stops. So to summarize all that, what I've done with my own personal decompression is backed away from deep stops, gradient factor low of 60, and I still do quite long shallow stops because I'm fairly risk averse when it comes to getting decompression sickness in places like Truck Lagoon or Bikini Atoll
Fair enough. All right. Well, Dr. Mitchell, I'm going to break us here because I definitely want to do a second part with you. And we want to cover into gas density, which is growing in terms of a hot topic. Would that be okay?
Of course. Yeah.
All right. Again, Benjamin Hadfield, Teach Me to Dive. If you like this kind of content, make sure to subscribe, because Simon Mitchell is a wealth of amazing knowledge and just has a tremendous amount to share with us. And in our next lecture and interview, we're going to be talking more about gas density, which is really kind of a burgeoning field, in my opinion. And there's just a tremendous amount of divers that don't understand the implications of gas density. So again, Benjamin Hadfield, Teach Me to Dive. Thank you for contributing, and make sure to subscribe.